There we go. Thank you so much for joining our discussion this evening about payment for ecosystem services that is hosted by the Takoma Stormwater Solution. You can find our website in the chat, and that will also lead you to our mission statement and to any number of documents, technical analyses, and policy statements that we have developed over the years. My name is David Reed. I'm an environmental economist, a member of Takoma Stormwater Solutions, and I'm also serving as president of the Long Branch Sligo Community Association for the time being. I'm also very honored to be joined this evening by Julie Greenburg, who is an amazing community organizer in the town of Somerset in the southwestern part of our county, Montgomery County. And among many activities, Julie has spearheaded a payment for ecosystem services, which I'll shorthand by saying PES, PES type arrangement in her community and town of Somerset. And she will share their really amazing success and advances in implementing their program. But tonight, we'd really like to be very practical and talk about how businesses and homeowners can work together to address the problems that are caused by stormwater runoff and flooding. And as we all know, that includes flooding in our basements, standing water in backyards, rotting roots, big gullies and ditches in front and backyards. And so as I go through the presentation, there no doubt will be any number of questions that arise. So I'd ask you, if you'd be so kind as to drop your questions and your comments into the chat, and we will have Steve Whitney, our moderator, then bring them forward as appropriate. And hopefully we'll be able to answer those questions. That's not always guaranteed. So at this point then, I will go ahead and share my screen and begin let's see if I can find it. Alrighty, I'll go ahead and put it into a presentation format then. How's that work?
Beautiful.
Okay, very good. So we've called this webinar Payment for Ecosystem Services, or as I said, PES for short. But in many ways, that title seems a little bit abstract or distant. So perhaps we could actually call our presentation tonight Sharing Responsibilities for Ecosystem Services. But to be honest, that even still seems a little bit distant. So what we really want to do is to talk about how to build a community-based stormwater runoff program. So I should say really that regardless of what title we put on the presentation, the underlying problem is the same. The human enterprise has steadily eroded, if not destroyed, the ecosystem services on which our own survival depends. So when we use the term ecosystem, we're talking about a geographic area where plants, animals, and other organisms, along with weather and landscapes, work together to create a thriving habitat of life. And when we use the term ecosystem services, we refer to the benefits that we, human beings, actually obtain from the ecosystems. And of course, that includes nature's provision of pollinators that allow food to grow, the ability of wetlands to absorb water, to purify water, the atmosphere's ability to absorb pollutants, and the soil's ability to absorb water. So once those ecosystem services were free and abundant, today those services are far more scarce, and often to obtain those very same ecosystem services, we have to pay dearly for them, considerable amounts of money. And in a very practical day-to-day terms, regarding stormwater runoff and flooding, our current ecosystem simply cannot safely manage and absorb the more frequent and greater volumes of precipitation. And as I mentioned, we're all familiar with the kind of consequences the breakdown of nature's ecosystem services bring: flooded basements, standing water, rotting trees, erosion, and much more. So over recent years, businesses and neighbors in our city are becoming aware that individual investments in water management can help mitigate those impacts. But by the same token, other neighbors and members of the community are discovering that there are limits to what individual households can do. And I say that despite having spent thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars on mitigation efforts. So in short, neighbors are finding that they need to work together to find communal solutions to manage this ever-growing volume and intensity of stormwater. And it's in that context, we think then that the PES type arrangement can be very beneficial. So in the presentation this evening, I will give a general overview of the 5 basic steps needed to develop and sustain a PES arrangement on private property, including a brief reference to the financing of how to finance such an arrangement. And then following my step-by-step presentation, Julie will translate that basic approach into the very real-life conditions in Somerset. As I mentioned, that's a town on the southwestern part of the county. And for the sake of the presentation, let's assume that our city government has done all that it can to manage stormwater and flooding problems in public spaces, largely through a combination of hard, what's called gray infrastructure, and green infrastructure. So let's just go ahead and take a look at the 5 basic steps that are required to set up a payment for ecosystem services. The first, and I'll go through the 5 quickly and come back and explore them a little bit more in depth. The first is recognizing the problem. The second is analyzing the causes of the problem, followed thereafter by agreeing on the corrective actions that are needed to address the causes. Then the longer-term process of implementing the agreed actions, and finally evaluating the results. So step 1, recognizing the problem. Now, this geography ought to be pretty familiar. It's one of in the backyards of our city. And as you can see, it's the topography is actually pretty steep. But in order to recognize the problem, the first issue that has to be addressed is what are the boundaries where the problems are occurring? Is it a street? Is it a neighborhood? Is it a whole drainage system? It's not clear. And that takes a good bit of analysis to actually figure out sometimes. And the second issue we face in trying to even recognizing the problem is what if only the downhill residents recognize that a problems exist? In tandem with that, what happens with the residents uphill who unknowingly contribute to the problem, but actually don't believe that there is a problem? So this dynamic really creates an interaction with with residents who have 3 different attitudes. Usually at the top, the homeowners frequently notice little, if any, stormwater damage. But then you get to the middle of the street or the area and problems begin to accumulate, minor flooding and erosion. And then of course, at the bottom, the problems are compounded with major damage to buildings, trees, as we mentioned. So those differences translate into very different attitudes about what should be done to correct the problems. So this situation makes clear that a lot of discussion and information sharing among neighbors is absolutely critical to understanding the severity of the problem. But for now, let's assume that the group has reached basic agreement about the problem and community members want to move forward in finding solutions. So this is analyzing the causes of the problem. And questions arise pretty immediately. Well, what kind of expert analysis is needed? Do we need landscape architects? Do we need hydrologists? Do we need civil engineers? Maybe we need a bunch of them to really tell us what is going on. It begs the question for the community group. Well, okay, let's suppose we're going to get a bunch of experts together. Who's going to analyze, who's going to review, who's going to supervise these experts that are coming to provide a service to them? And then the question that also gets asked, should the contract with an analytical team, should it also recommend actions and the probable costs of solutions? So one of the key issues that arises here is the fact that the origins of a problem may be outside our city boundaries. I mean, in particular, further upstream in Montgomery County. And this is very much the case with Sligo Creek. And indeed, that may soon become a major problem with the development of the area surrounding the Takoma Metro Station. But again, let's assume that the analysis has been done. They've contracted the experts. They've come forward with a good analytical and a set of proposals on what needs to be done to correct the problem. It also begs the question in this final area here is, well, what should the neighbors do if they can't afford the analysis? As indeed, as we'll explain, actually happened to us is when we were trying to organize a PS arrangement a bit earlier last year. Well, let's assume then that the team, the community groups has gotten together and they want to begin implementing the work that needs to be done. And so basically what comes up, a number set of issues. Here you are dealing with this question of different views of people, participants in the program. How do neighbors determine who will pay for which actions? Do the neighbors only pay for the actions that are on their property? Well, what happens with the folks upstream that are really causing the whole problem to begin with? And here we are. Well, what do neighbors do if the key neighbors, again uphill, won't participate? And we also come to deal with the question of what needs to be included in an implementation contract. Okay, of course, the activities, yes, sequencing, and we need to have a time frame. But again, one of the key issues, as always, is what is the financial commitment of the neighbors? What do we do? And this is not a moot issue. What do neighbors do if others in their group can't afford the full remediation package? Are there other funding sources? Is a legal contract required to move forward with this? What if the neighbors can't afford a lawyer? These are not simple answers that have to be developed. It requires a lot of work among all the participants. But let's assume then that the group has worked out a lot of these issues and are moving forward with implementing the remediation measures. Questions that arise: who's going to manage the agreement, including managing the activities of the contractors? Well, you just say, okay, the contractors will do it without community supervision. What happens if a neighbor halfway through the process says, I don't like what's happening, I can no longer afford it, I'm going to pull out of this deal? And then what happens if the implemented activities are not up to professional standards? So these are really not simple issues, but ones that really do arise consistently in the process of creating the PES arrangement. And as you can see in the questions that I've raised, the institutional issues, the institutional capacity, the organization of the community is really quite fundamental in determining what the longer term outcome is. And this will then take us to, and assume that the projects have been implemented, to the final step in this process. It's a multi-year program of reviewing performance. And here we have a really extraordinary group of activists and members of our city. We have the director of the Department of Public Works and chief engineer. We have two council members, Randy Gibson and Cindy Dubala, and members of the LIDC team, which we'll talk about a little bit. And so the question that arises, who should perform the evaluation? And when do you do it? Should it be midterm so you can make corrections? Do you wait to the end, try to review it? Who pays for the review? And then what do you do at the end? Can you dissolve and modify the agreement? Can you renew the agreement? These are just very basic issues that arise in the course of following through the 5 steps that I've just briefly summarized. Now, PES programs have been implemented in jurisdictions involving millions of people. For instance, the Catskills and Hudson River Valley are in participation with New York City. And other PES arrangements have been developed in Costa Rica, many developing countries. Here in Takoma Park in Montgomery County, PES type arrangements will be far more modest, say involving 8 neighboring residences on the same street. Or as in the town of Somerset, some 20 homes in a sub-drainage area. But regardless of the size, financing issues lie at the heart of the process of building a PES arrangement, even for a pilot project that we're trying to develop here in Takoma Park. In fact, one of the reasons that our initial effort to create a PES pilot in Takoma Park was the lack of financial resources to analyze the problems that was besetting a group of neighbors in a Ward 3 locality. In addition to conducting technical analysis, startup funding may be needed to draw up legal agreements. And of course, you need money later on to actually implement the recommended projects. As TSS, that Takoma Stormwater Solutions, documented through our 2022 survey involving over 250 households, many families in the city have invested thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, trying to improve runoff arrangements in their properties. Further, most parents, we have to point, most families do not have resources ready at hand to cover the costs of a PES program. And so consequently, modest external funding is necessary even for a pilot project. So as we researched possible funding sources, we realized that there are a number of potential financial providers, such as the Fish and Wildlife Foundation and any number of state resiliency programs, which could contribute to a range of PES activities in our city. But we also discovered that accessing those external resources depends on demonstrating through a modest pilot project the viability and the effectiveness of a PES initiative in our city. And furthermore, in that research process, we discovered that accessing external resources, particularly at this early stage, depends on a clear, proactive engagement of our city government in supporting a pilot and subsequent PES efforts. So, for example, support could come from the Takoma Park stormwater fees or through a joint city-community fundraising initiative. So at present, yes, we are exploring the interest of several neighborhood groups in initiating modest pilot projects. We also want to highlight that the city's Stormwater Management Board has hired the Low Impact Development Center to analyze 20 priority problem locations in the city. We very much look forward to the results of their analysis and hope that'll come forward in several months or so. The city has also engaged Rain Plan, which is a private company specializing in retrofitting residences to the growing challenges of managing stormwater runoff and flooding. So indeed, we hope that LIDC report and contributions will allow us to move forward in developing a solid pilot project and hope thereafter to multiply that successful initiative effort. So I will close my presentation now, and I would like to invite then Julie Greenburg to walk us through the experience in Somerset to illustrate how collaboration with their town council, with Low Impact Development Center and Rain Plan, following the leadership provided by the citizens group, has really allowed them to address many of the issues that I've brought up in this presentation. So Julie, I would like now to turn this over to you.
Thanks, David. Let me share my screen. Okay, everybody can see the share. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what you can see is has been a multi-year process. I'm going to start at the beginning, and we're definitely not at the end. We've gone through steps, basically 1 through 4 of the 5 that David outlined. The first step, recognizing the problem. So our town of Somerset establishes committees as a way to provide feedback to the town council, a 5-member citizen town council. And we had a study committee that I was part of that began working in November of 2020 after many cacophonous public hearings about permits granted for development that revolved around tree removal and stormwater runoff issues. And the committee was charged with defining the problems, analyzing the efficacy, costs, and benefits of how to remediate drainage problems. And we soon began to focus on increasing on-site storage with green infrastructure, rain gardens, conservation landscaping, things such as that. And we organized an inclusive process to gather information, prioritize key issues, and develop recommendations. So this is a multi-year process. We went then to analyzing the problem, step 2 in David's 5-step process. We developed a report and had 2 buckets of recommendations. I'm going to talk mainly about the second bucket. The first bucket had to do with changes to the town's building code. We have our own code, which enables us to go beyond county regulations in terms of the stringency. And we did that in 2 areas that I'll go through very briefly. And then the second part where our focus tonight is focusing on the community-based stormwater projects in micro watersheds or sub drainage areas in which drainage problems were so great that they couldn't be resolved by increasing on-site storage on any one private property. Now, I should say, I meant to mention, and let me just throw this in now before we go any further, about the issue of these committees. Committee we established has now been replicated in the village of Chevy Chase. They've set up their own stormwater committee. And depending on the nature of how citizens get involved in committees, I think it's a great vehicle for a town government to receive formal recommendations from the community. And if there's some way that Takoma Park can establish an official committee to advise town government, I think it would be might be a great vehicle for you as well. So about the first bucket, these code changes. First of all, these are code changes that only are prospective. They affect homes only if there is construction, but it can be large construction or small construction that increases impervious surface. So we've got for new homes, when we have a tear down and complete rebuild, we have essentially affirmed the county's standard for storing runoff from a 1-year storm and installing a permeable driveway. But what we are doing is really holding firm to those requirements and not granting the pretty ubiquitous waivers that the county grants in most cases for very little charge. And so there's very little disincentive to request a waiver instead of installing some kind of additional green infrastructure. We also are trying to have additional storage of runoff from renovations of when 150 square feet or more of impervious surface is added, and when anybody replaces a driveway, under most conditions, they would be required to put in a permeable driveway. Now going to that second bucket, this was produced by an organization that David mentioned just a bit ago, the Low Impact Development Center. The town, as part of the committee's investigations and work, contracted with the Low Impact Development Center for a comprehensive survey of all of the properties, private properties, not public, but private properties in Somerset, to evaluate drainage on the property and to create a dashboard that enabled us to get a better fix on whether the property was generating runoff, pass through for runoff, or a place where runoff that received runoff from other properties. And in addition to that, they took did a particularly deep dive into the drainage in 4 particular areas that had significant drainage problems. This is one of those areas. It includes actually 24 lots contribute to are in one micro watershed that you see in front of you. This is a micro watershed that has a significant drop in elevation. The homes or the properties on the right side of the screen are quite a bit higher than the ones on the left, and the water runs from right to left in such quantities that people can take out a board and pretty much surf down over the lawns in a heavy rain. The LIDC came up with a potential bioswale plan that would cross over the property lines of 8 of the properties that would attempt to alleviate some of the drainage problems that, you know, just go from uphill to downhill. And this was presented to the town as one of 4 plans, as I said. It's formed the basis of the work I'm going to describe now. This particular drainage area was not one that we decided would be the first one to try a pilot program in which the households in all of the micro watershed work together. But this was, in this 3rd phase of this work, definitely a remediation measure that would involve this community-based approach, and maybe this will be one that we will take up at some later point. So the proceeding in this 3rd phase of work required a little bit more fine-tuning and public buy-in. LIDC left off with these 4 sketches that were, you know, had some technical detail, but not a great amount. And so now the town has moved to contract with another engineering entity, Baylands, and the Baylands contract includes 2 deliverables. In another micro watershed that I don't have a sketch of, but again, it involves, in this case, there's 14 households, and it's called the Dew micro watershed because it's bounded by 3 streets: Dorset, Essex, and Warwick. And Bayland is going to provide a concept plan that it provides more technical detail than where LIDC left off, and help us form another committee. The committee is the vehicle by which we're going to move forward to get the buy-in from the residents in that micro watershed, and then come back to the town council to talk about the allocation of where public funds could best be expended, and where private households will agree to contribute their own private funding. So now we're on to step 4, actual implementation. So we're not quite there yet. We're on the cusp of this, is what I would say. The plan is by Bayland, the work by Bayland is just now starting. So assuming that they develop this plan that is technically sound and says this is where the installation should go, and this is how much storage they'll add, and these are the drainage problems that will be solved, and these are the ones that can't be solved easily, but we feel that we'll have mitigated as best we can. And we've got not unanimity, but at least a strong consensus among households that this is something that we believe provides enough public and private benefit to move forward. Then the town will post a second request for proposal for potentially even a 3rd company. We might go back we might go to Rain Plan, which is a group associated with LIDC, as David mentioned. There might be some other company, but then we'll actually get to the contracts for installation of the green and gray infrastructure that implement the plan. So we are just about to, Bayland is just about to get started on this. Yeah, so I don't have anything on the fifth step because that's evaluation. But I do want to take a minute to talk a little bit more about the financing, because this is like a thorny issue, like how do you get the money for this? And I just want to outline in one place sort of what the town of Somerset thus far has invested. We have not looked for outside sources of funding, and we've not tapped households for their private expenditures. The town committee, as I mentioned, was supported with a $40,000 contract to LIDC, and Bayland's work to refine the plans in this one micro watershed is $27,000. And we don't know what the town may be asked by this newly formed, the committee that's now in formation, to invest in green and gray infrastructure in areas that would not, where it would not otherwise be installed to reduce drainage problems throughout. That's, we anticipate that there will be public investment in this, not that every household in this micro watershed will invest on their own. Now, this is the question here, and this is a question that I think is really at the crux of getting public financing is, you know, well, how do we motivate a public, you know, government to, in the midst of all the demands that are being placed on it for all sorts of investments and very, very, you know, programs that, or practices that are of great public benefit. How do we make the case for a public investment? Well, there were sort of, I think, three elements to this in Somerset. Public sentiment was very clear in this, that people were really concerned about this. And this became an issue in 2 town council election cycles, that this was an issue on which candidates for the town council made their positions known. Did they care about stormwater runoff? Did they think it was a real nuisance in the community, that it was something we had to try to address as a community? And that was a deciding factor in elections. Second, we had data. The survey that the Stormwater Study Committee did had great participation. About half the households responded, and conservatively they estimated that they, in the last 5 years prior to the survey, had about $3 million in losses in largely failed remediation for runoff, that they had drainage problems that could not be solved on their own property by their own efforts. And then the town council and the mayor have worked through in internal discussions. These are all public, but you know, they're discussions among themselves. They have really resolved and been committed to the idea that it is of broad public benefit if installations that have benefit multiple households can be identified, and if they're you know, it's a cost-efficient public good to make investment, and that often that investment, and this goes to something David pointed out, overcomes one of the features of this problem, which is that households at the top of slopes are just don't recognize sometimes the issues that the runoff off their property is causing. And unless there can be some public subsidy to have them remediate as much as they can, everything can be sort of stalled in its tracks. And so if a public subsidy to householders at the top can generate public good throughout a watershed, that's a really good outcome. So our council has really bought into that, and I think that's been really pivotal to our success. We're still not there. As I said, we're just starting, but with the Bayland work. But residents, the households in that micro watershed have all had at least one site visit, with one exception, on their property. We've been communicating with them a lot, and so far nobody has started balking at this, and we're hoping that we can really continue to have a fairly smooth implementation of something that serves as a model for other parts of the community in Somerset and elsewhere as well. So thanks for letting me present on that. And I guess when we turn to questions, I'm happy to answer any.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. It really shows a very real life how helpful, how necessary this kind of experience is. And I think it's particularly instructive to see, as you mentioned, Julie, that it took the town governance system, the town council, 2 electoral cycles in order to put enough representatives on the board to do something about a problem that was really tearing at the heart of the community.
Right.
And, you know, we are very happy to point out that we have 3 council members, city council members on the webinar tonight. Thank you so much, Randy, Kara, and Cindy, for being with us. And we've been through 1 election cycle, and things have certainly started improving here in Takoma Park, at least the uptake and interest in this issue by our council. So I'll be happy to respond to any questions. Steve will be moderating that for us and just bringing them forward for our attention.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think we have 2 very good questions. Let's see, let's take the first one. Someone asked, why are we talking about pilot project? What makes the projects that have taken place so far? Why are we talking about pilot projects, and what would be the difference between a pilot project and another kind of project?
That's an important question. As we alluded to in the early comments of the presentation, payment for ecosystem service experiences have been successful around the world. Whether, as I say, in the Catskills and Hudson River Valley that provides cleaner water to millions of residents in New York City, or in Costa Rica and Morocco and other places. But the fact is, there has not been a PES type arrangement set up here in Takoma Park. And in fact, not to our knowledge, other than Somerset in Montgomery County. And in addition, very few, if any, experiences in Maryland. So this makes potential contributors, both city, municipal, county governments, hesitant to invest in, quote, an unproven approach, when in fact it has been proven around the world, but it has not been proven locally, and the benefits cannot be quantified. As an economist, I can tell you, you have to quantify the benefits one way or another, the cost and benefits and trade-off and so forth. So that a pilot project then becomes the proof of concept. It becomes the guarantee that this approach can work, and it can provide the hard data, both hydrological as well as financial, that can sway the governments and other donors. There are many, as we discovered, there are quite a number of resiliency programs at the state level that could potentially contribute on a much broader scale to PES type arrangements. But the proof of concept is fundamental and necessary in order to unlock those resources. So it's a really important question. Thanks to whoever asked it. And that's really where we are. Whereas I can speak about my experiences and Julie can speak about hers. We need the proof of concept for a broader arrangement.
Can I follow up? That was, at least I was one of the people with that question.
Yeah.
Right, Jennifer.
How do you prove the concept if you're, I mean, I assume what you're saying for a pilot is you're taking a tiny piece of the whole and just testing it on a tiny piece. Like, how do you define something that isn't the whole big picture for a pilot?
there are a number of factors that will go into choosing a pilot. And I think one of the most important ones is the willingness and the dedication, as Julie has demonstrated, of the residents to make it work. So in our first effort to organize PES type arrangement, there were approximately 12 to 14 households that were interested, and who over years had experienced the challenges of significant runoff and flooding damage. Unfortunately, as I said, we did not have resources from the city or elsewhere to do the analytical work, and we certainly did not have money to do the engineering, the technical work. Another reason that project did not move forward is the fact that one of the lead organizer actually had to move out of the city and was not able to continue. Although there were some investments, say from Casey Trees and others supporters, to try to get that pilot off the ground, just weren't able to do it. And so it is in trying to host this type of webinar that we hope to inform people on how it works to try. And we are very willing, of course, to provide technical assistance and guidance, and underlying this, of course, is our hope that we will be able to partner with the city government, with the Department of Public Works and the Stormwater Management Board, in order to really demonstrate that this is a way of alleviating so many of the problems in the city. I'm not sure that I answered. Please, so if you have hot pursuit, please.
Yeah, maybe we can move on just to make sure we cover all the questions here. But I would say just in general, I think usually also when you talk about a pilot, the city government is not obligated by an existing policy to repeat the pilot. It's a one-off, and when something becomes city policy, the city's got its obligations to act in a particular way, and you run a pilot in order to come up with a policy. And I'd say in contracting, until you're operating on an established policy, you're running a pilot. And it gives you a lot of freedom that you won't have after you've created the city policy. It's one of the difficulties of running a government. There's a good question for Julie about what kind of funds you may have looked at. Did you pursue any of the rebate monies from the county's Rainscape program? Julie, was Rainscapes a source of funding for you?
Not for the on sort of a global level. What I would say is that Somerset households have taken advantage of Rainscapes from the beginning of the program, and we probably have about 50 or 60 properties that have gotten rebates for green infrastructure installations, probably the highest density in the county. If Baylands provides a plan to households that indicates that they believe, say, a rain garden could be installed on property, and then the overall plan for submission to the town council of essentially this PES plan, you know, where is the public investment going to go? Where is the private investment going to go? Who's obligated to do what? If the private household is the plan says this is an investment in infrastructure that the private household will make in this due micro watershed, and that private household has not exhausted the reservoir of rebate money available to them, which I think is about $7,500, they can go to Rainscapes and get help. This would be part of their private financing of the entire arrangement for the due watershed. That will be in the plan that's submitted. So we are going to continue to take advantage of, as residents have in the past, but it's not going to be on it's done on a private basis as it has been to date. This is why this arrangement of, you know, what the committee will propose to the town council, who's going to pay what for what type of infrastructure, is going to be a pretty elaborate proposal, and it's going to involve a lot of cooperation. But you know, we're hoping that that Rainscapes will figure into that.
Okay, thank you for that, because I think what you pointed out is that even though Takoma Park does not qualify for Rainscape funding, there are two levels of funding. One is funding for at the individual
Right,
property owner level, and then funding at the shared project
right.
level.
Yes,
And I think that's something that in Takoma Park, we have to think about, because people may be able to get funding individually that wouldn't be available to the group effort. And the group effort may be able to get funding that is not available to the individual. That's
exactly.
part of the power, I think, of this approach. Thank you. Another question. Did you all hire analysts to identify what was going on the different properties that need remediating? I think that question means who hired the analysts, or?
Well, this is all town council contracting, but I must say that committee members were involved in development of the request for proposal that resulted in the LIDC contract and in the Bayland contract. So it's been a process in which the residents through these committees have provided the capacity for the town to contract in the way that the committee feels would be most productive.
Okay. I have I think you may have partly answered a question that I had, which I'm going to put in the chat right now. And it seems to me that the professionalism of the analysis that you had must have done a lot to contribute to the general community buy-in. In other words, it's not just one person's view. It's not just a very deeply heartfelt complaint that a property owner has, but you'd actually gotten some professional analysis. Did that make the difference I think it might have made?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is a virtuous cycle that the committee demonstrated in the first instance its commitment. We produced in the end over 100 pages of report of what we had found in the town. The committee made a sincere enough request, a legitimate request that was perceived as very legitimate to the town council, to get support and that generated in turn a serious commitment by a LIDC to produce information, which then sort of filled in any blanks and increased people's confidence that we were on the right track. So I don't think there was a anybody took any part of this casually and relied on just glad handing, or we'll just make a little 5-minute presentation and get some support for this. I think it's been taken very seriously by all parties, all the stakeholders from the beginning.
I read your report, and one thing that I would like you to comment on was the role of your residents getting out in rainstorms.
Yeah, we decided that we really had to be in the field when the runoff was the greatest. And so there were numerous people on this committee, 8-person committee, who, when it rained, they responded to requests from residents. Oh, come see it, come see this problem I've got, and they went out in their boots and they did it and they filmed it. And we have a Dropbox, or actually it's now in a Google Docs folder, repository of all these videos and photos of what I don't know how many properties in town look like in a heavy rainstorm. So yeah, I mean, this was very, very grounded research in all senses.
Yeah. Another question that I have that I will also put in the chat, because this was in the back of my mind from the very beginning, was this one. You have a stormwater committee that is making efforts to plan in a comprehensive way. How would something like that look in Takoma Park? You mentioned that, but I was wondering if you could maybe describe the members of your committee and how your committee has survived, grown, or whatever.
The members are just good-hearted citizens that I had some level of background in this, but not that much. And it was many decades old. And so they were just people who joined without a lot of background. And I think that actually helped us establish credibility, is that we didn't take anything for granted and educated ourselves. I don't really know, because we have a committee. I don't even know how many committees Somerset has. And now the first committee that dealt with developing some recommendations on the problem has folded, and there'll be a new committee that deals with the development of this due plan. I don't know how Takoma Park is structured to enable, or if there is any process by which a committee is selected by a mayor or council, or we have a set structure for chartering a committee and nominating its members, and the committees can call on the town attorney for assistance. They can go to the town council and ask for resources. Resources can be allocated by the town through a contract to a committee. So, if there is anything comparable, or if it's seen to be worthwhile and it hasn't, no process has been established, this seems to me a really good problem to establish it for, if it's not already there. And I just don't know what town policy and practice, or Takoma Park's policy and practice.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there was a comment here that a consulting firm of environmentalists has been hired. How would a committee be different from a consulting firm of environmentalists who have been hired?
Well,
could consultants be this committee?
I think that serves a different function. There's the technical side of things, and that, of course, that group could contribute to making a technical case. Residents are the ones who are being flooded, and residents are the ones who, in our case, appreciated our empathy and feeling of solidarity is what I would say. There was a sense of solidarity. We're in this, and we're going to figure it out on our own behalves. And I think there's something about that kind of public commitment that is valuable.
Okay, thanks. And then another question: Does Somerset have a stormwater management permit, MS4, or are you under the county's MS4?
Oh, we're under the county's MS4. Yeah, and we follow. I mean, we're under the county's regulations in all respects, except, as I said, when we go above and beyond, as we have now in stormwater runoff from property that is adding the 150 square feet of impervious surface.
I wonder if somebody on the webinar could explain what MS4 is, because not necessarily, there are probably people who may not understand what that is. Julie, maybe you could explain how MS4
I have
permitting.
just the most basic understanding of MS4, which is that under federal and the state implementation of federal regulations that have to do with runoff, non-point source pollution sources of all types, there is a certain amount of the county comes up with calculations that deal with runoff of from residential lots and runoff from streets and runoff from parking lots, and the pollution that runoff carries into waterways. That can be mitigated countywide. So if there's additional pollution in Takoma Park from some new parking lot, and there's a new holding pond up in Gaithersburg that will reduce pollution from non-point sources up there, that's, it's even Steven. And so the county goes through this process of calculating this, and we, our town government plays no role, and we don't have to turn to them and say, oh yeah, we just changed our town code, therefore you should do move that decimal point in your MS4 permit about the non-point source pollution in Somerset. So it's a very global bureaucratic calculation, and it's not something we dealt with at all, basically.
It's a lot to ask on the spot, but I noticed that Daryl is on the on the call and on the webinar, and just what is the burden on the city of having the MS4 and what benefits?
Sure. Thank you. I've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you all for putting this together. As always, your webinars are really informative. On a technical basis, the MS4 is actually an abbreviation for municipal separate stormwater systems. So it's actually a result of the Federal Clean Water Act. So states have requirements for water pollution control. And if you're a jurisdiction that manages your stormwater system, which the city has been since the late 80s, you're required to get a state permit, in this case through the Maryland Department of Environment, related to water pollution control measures that you must put in place. So in the past, the regulations and requirements have been getting more and more restrictive over time. There are 6 control measures that need to be put in place. And in the last 5-year permit cycles, there's also a requirement for the jurisdiction to provide treatment to the maximum extent practicable, MEP, for environmental site design to manage stormwater on 20% of the existing impervious surface. So the city has a stormwater permit that is overseen by the county, issued on a 5-year basis. Our current one goes into 2025. And we have annual reports that we need to fill out, and requirements to show how we're making progress towards that 20% treatment goal, as well as the other 6 standards associated with the state and federal requirements. So it is a regulatory system. It's fairly rigorous in terms of what it requires, and the city is obligated, based on our position as managing stormwater for the city of Takoma Park, to have programs in place to manage those control measures and report accordingly.
Okay, so what I think this all adds up to is that the city has a considerable regulatory burden that Somerset doesn't have, that is performed by the county in their case. Mm-hmm. But I guess the city is also able to collect stormwater fees, right? Because we're the MS4 permit.
Yeah, it's kind of with these kind of things. It's sort of, I see it as 2 sides of the hand. The city does have the burden as the local jurisdiction, but it means that we're very close to the problem, very close to the issue, and we can manage it in a very direct way. We do have the requirement, but we also are very, very local. I talked to jurisdictions in Prince George's County, for instance, similar size to us. Many of those are, in fact, all of Prince George's County municipalities fall within the county MS4 permit. So the county oversees the stormwater permit requirements, which means that they're a little fish in a very big pond. Whereas for Takoma Park, having the MS4 permit, we're kind of a big fish in a little pond, our 2.2 square miles. So there's pros and cons on both of that. It does add a regulatory burden. It does add a cost complexity, and it does add requirements and reporting. But it also means that we're very focused and local, and rather than dealing with the county as a whole and trying to get attention from the county for a stormwater problem we may be having, we only have to get attention from the city. So it enables us to manage our stormwater issues on a very localized level.
Is there anything in the MS4 program that would encourage the city to deal with damage on private property? Because I think most of the people who are here tonight are people who are feeling pain as a private property owner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's possible to meet the MS4 requirements with doing nothing on private property. And we were just wondering, how could the city's handling of its MS4 obligations also embrace this problem that people are reporting in the city?
Yeah. It's definitely something that the council and the city has been talking about for many, many years. It's typically a problem of program scope and funding. The city does have a 5-year capital improvement programs related to stormwater, where we have identified programs and projects that are needed to improve water quality and manage stormwater to keep it off private property. So we've got a very long list of projects and needs. So we have those already sort of established. With every major storm, we learn of new problems and new issues. We also try to be proactive. The city videos our stormwater system on a 5-year cycle. We do pipe cleaning. We have everything videoed and mapped out on GIS. So we're very aware of where our system is and when it's working and when it's not. But beyond that, I think that's the next place for us to go, to collaborate and coordinate with private properties and neighborhoods where severe problems are happening that may not be coming from the public right of way. If there is a problem coming from the public right of way affecting private property, the city has every reason and requirement to identify that and work on it. I think the more challenging issues are one that are between and not related to sources from the public right of way. That being said, and I don't want to take up any more time. As I said, it's been really informative and interesting. The city has contracted with the LIDC Center. They're doing an analysis for us, a stormwater resiliency study. We hope to have the second of 4 public meetings relative to their analysis. They visited 20 sites in the city that have identified as flood prone. All of those were related to private property impacts. And so from that work, they'll be developing some recommendations for all those sites, but going into more detail on 2 of the sites. But in addition to that, they will be creating a dashboard through Rain Plan that all property owners can use to access information about their property, analyze and evaluate potential possibilities and options for stormwater control. And so we're looking forward to rolling that out in the upcoming months.
So that means there would be an application on the web that I would be able to look at. I'd be able to put in my address.
Yeah, the Rain Plan system will be web-based, and you'll be able to take a look at your property. It'll use aerial imagery and do some data analysis in terms of soil type, impervious area, stormwater runoff, and some overview of methods and mechanisms that you might be able to use to manage that, with the option of then communicating with the Rain Plan folks for a video analysis and some consultation related to programs and projects that may be most effective based on the conditions on your property.
Very interesting.
Steve,
And-
I'm wondering if one of our three council members would like to share their thoughts about the presentations this evening, suggestions, observations in general.
David, Randy here.
Yeah, go Randy.
I had a question to Julie. Why did, Julie, did you not ask private households to make a contribution to the cause?
Well, I don't know that we've foreclosed on that option in terms of the work going forward in this due micro watershed. It's very possible that there will be some installations for which public funding seems really appropriate for the public good, and many other installations for which the private household where the installation or part of it could be built will be asked to make a contribution, and then potentially get a rain plan rebate for that. So yeah, we haven't said no, that's not going to be part of the plan. It just has to be negotiated as to who does what and to what extent.
Julie,
Thank you.
may I comment here on what Julie, your private citizens have available to them? A block or a organization can be created, such as a HOA style,
Right.
and then you could become eligible for that $20,000 rebate that goes to an organization from the Rainscapes program. We in Takoma Park are not part of that, but that is an opportunity. That's why I put in the chat about that. And also a little clarification on an MS4. MS4 was created to control pollution discharges into stormwater and into the Chesapeake Bay. It's not generally been, the impervious surface makes it important to stormwater management, but that program was really about pollution, not about stormwater management. And now it's moving towards that when you see the impervious surface ratio. Just a couple of comments I wanted to get into. Thank you.
Let's see if Cara and Cindy have comments following Randy's observations. And again, so glad you all could join us.
I'll speak. I don't know if I can't see Cindy on my screen here. This is Kara. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry my screen's so dark. That was a really fantastic presentation. I'm sorry I had to join a little bit late, but I was at a previous one a little bit, heard a few details before also about Somerset. I was wondering if you could remind me kind of what % of households in Somerset are part of any one of these many watersheds, because one of the things that strikes me is that you said that the local elections were really kind of a mandate, and it took 2 whole cycles before you had enough folks that ran on that campaign platform. And I would say it becomes a bit more complex here in Takoma Park, the way we're divided, just getting that kind of mandate across the city, because there are different parts that are affected a lot more than others, but I would imagine that's true in any city. So if you could maybe just speak to how many of your households find themselves in one of these mini watersheds, like the % or the number.
Well, in the 4 that have the worst problems, I would say we probably have as many as 20%. And we think that there's probably a total of 8 that have significant enough drainage problems that they could also potentially consider this micro watershed shared infrastructure approach. So maybe 40%. But there's scattered problems throughout. It's really a rare, it's a hilly little town when you actually start walking around and checking out the topography. I don't think we ever encountered anybody sort of harumphing and saying, well, I don't have any drainage problems on my property, so I don't care about this. There's a lot of buy-in, even from people who are relatively less affected. And we don't have district type council representation. It's 5 at-large seats, so people don't sort themselves out electorally by problem area. So, you know, I guess it's, there has, I don't think this is this has become a, you know, have or have not or kind of issue where there's dissension along those lines. I think certainly we don't, I think there would be, it'd be problematic for the town to overinvest public funds. But when you have some households in town having basically lost between loss of cars that were drowned in the garage, you know, and investment in infrastructure, gray infrastructure, $300,000 on one property at the bottom of a hill. I mean, that sort of impresses itself upon people.
I've got over 50 in mine.
Okay, we have another question.
I'm just wondering if
this is-
Cindy has a comment, Steve.
Oh,
Before.
okay.
I don't actually. Thank you very much for this. This has been really interesting. And as all of you on the call know, I've been interested in doing this kind of work for some time. And other than that, I won't say much other than to point out the obvious differences between a town like Somerset and or Chevy Chase and Takoma Park. So in working through these issues, we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you. It is true. It's the path forward is not simple. I think I think everybody recognizes that, and the amount of funding available is one of the major challenges. There's an interesting question here. Can a private citizen construct a rain garden in the tree box between street and sidewalk? I think they mean the little right-of-way area. That's a little detailed question, but it's one that I think is reflects a challenge of a city being involved with private property owners. We have different property out there. Some belongs to the city, some belongs to private. And for the city to get involved in private and for private people to get involved in the city starts getting a little murky. Can somebody make a comment about that?
I had answered Dan directly, but generally any work done in the public right of way would require a permit from the city, whether it's a utility company or a private property owner. So we do have a permit review process for that. That being said, we typically would not be supportive of private property owner doing a rain garden within the public right of way. There'd need to be a specific condition or situation in which it was beneficial. The city has done, we have about 95 stormwater retention facilities within the public right of way that the city has installed since 2007. So that's kind of an area that we're actively working on. And again, as I mentioned, we do have a long list of planned and proposed projects every year funded through the Stormwater Fund. So that area is typically used by the city for stormwater management, public right-of-way trees, as well as the utility access to properties. So in general, it's not usually a good location. It's also typically pretty small, pretty compact, pretty tough area for something like a rain garden. And there are probably better locations within private property for those kinds of things. But again, each situation is unique. So if there was a condition or a reason why someone was interested in doing that, they could certainly engage us through the application and permit process, and we would have that conversation.
Daryl, is it fair to say that you know, we see a lot of people that have done what you might call the Lady Bird Johnson beautification in that strip throughout the city as well, and seems to be that it's tolerated if it's not, you know, being adverse to the stormwater system. or public safety. You do seem to have a policy of some leniency. So if Dan wanted to plant in that strip, that a rain garden is a technical thing, but any planting you put in that strip and loosening of the soil will obviously help absorb and transevaporate water, especially runoff.
Yeah, the only restriction in the city is you can't plant woody shrubs or trees. That's got to be done by the city itself. But if you want to plant annuals or perennials and landscape your green strip instead of grass, highly support that. So that is the adjacent property owner has the responsibility for maintaining that little green strip. So if instead of grass, you want to have wood chips or river rock or a Zen sand garden, go for it.
And I would just like to add one point that one of the things that the first Stormwater Committee did as one of its most important activities was a tour of households that had taken advantage of rainscapes or gone on their own and installed green infrastructure. And these are some of the most beautifully landscaped properties in the town. And I think one of the points we were trying to get across is that building green infrastructure improves your property in so many ways, not just drainage. Aesthetically, it's an improvement usually. There are magnificent native plants and installing a rain garden or a berm or something can add to the interest in the topography on your lot. And I think we convince people. And I think the idea of investing in infrastructure for purposes of improving drainage is not a punishment. It's not detract. It's an investment. And that's something that I think is a really important point that we did with a tour, and that it should accompany any kind of public discussion of this problem.
Along those lines, anybody who's interested in the effects of, I'd say, a whole block investing in green infrastructure, walk from here to Silver Spring and go up Gist Avenue in the summer and go up some of the other avenues instead that are bare. Gist is like an oasis. It's lovely. And it's just one block. And I think that people on the block just decided they were going to do it. And it's really very nice. There's another question. Does Somerset have any disincentives that limit people's use of impervious surfaces? What kind of disincentives do you have for impervious surfaces? I think you kind of touched on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we've gone into that in a big way. I mean, we are trying to encourage permeable driveways. But there's no incentive beyond what you can get from rainscapes for that. Yeah.
And with your new standard, if somebody makes a change of over 150 square feet, isn't there?
Oh, right. That they need to essentially they need to store on site a 1-inch rainfall, which is about 2.6 inches of rainfall on whatever, times whatever square inches in area they've added.
Yeah, and generally speaking, store on site means it's not impervious.
Well, yeah, either it is not impervious, or you have a rain garden next to it that absorbs, or
exactly right. Yeah. That's a term that people don't always understand. You say store on site, doesn't necessarily mean it's in a cistern.
No, not in a cistern.
Yeah. Steve, can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, Julie, I guess a question about the risk of loss value for flooded areas versus the value that you talked a little bit about having, with rainscapes and other conservation landscaping. I believe that there's some real estate service that even looks at properties with regard to, the potential risk and is that something that is a driver? Have you seen any change in the value? Do you have any sense of the risks there with climate change to the value of the properties in Somerset?
Think we have only talked in, very, very general terms about that. We didn't try to quantify that in any way.
Mhm.
I think there are some lots in town where even a casual observer could take a look at places where vegetation won't even grow because of drainage problems. And if you could turn that around with a few trees and some conservation landscaping, and possibly a rain garden, you could, you could just imagine how the property value could increase. But we didn't get that technical.
Thank you.
Alrighty, folks, I think we're reaching the end of our 8:30 allocated time. Unless there's any urgent follow-up hot pursuit question, I certainly would like to thank you all for showing up and working with us this evening, and certainly look forward to opportunities of working with you in the future. I think we know that precipitation is going to be more intense and in greater volume, and one way or another we'll see each other either out in the street or working together in the parks.
Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to thank you all again and bring our discussion to a close.